Okay, now we're going to take a look at how we can handle exceptions in our application, and let's just go back to our delete handler and we'll do something that generates an exception instead of returning an API response. And we can do this quite easily. We'll just comment out the if activity equals null, return null, because if we try and remove an activity that doesn't exist and activity is null, then this is going to generate an exception from this method. So what we can do, just to test the response we currently get back for exceptions, if we go back to Postman and we try and delete a non-existent activity once again, this time we're going to get an exception. And it tells us that we're getting an argument null exception and value cannot be null. And this is our stack trace. Great. But what we're seeing here is effectively a developer exception page. We would not see this if we were in production. And if we go back to VS Code and let's go to our startup class, then inside here what we have, if we're running in development, inside our configure method we have a request to use the developer exception page. And that's why we see what we do. And if we were in production, then we would never hit this developer exception page. Our exception would never be handled. And we'd just get a generic 500 server error back in Postman. We're not going to test that. We're going to create our own exception handling middleware. And remember, everything inside this configure method is effectively middleware, and we can use this to configure the HTTP request pipeline. So what we're going to do is create some additional middleware that we can add to this pipeline to handle our exceptions. But first of all, let's clean things up at the top, apart from the startup class. And inside let's clean some of these folders up as well. Inside the core, in the application project, let's create a new class and we'll call it app exception. And inside this class we'll create three properties. We'll have an int for the status code, we'll have a string for the message, and we'll have a string for and we'll call it details, but this is going to be our stack trace from our exception. And what we'll do is we'll just create a constructor. So we'll use the quick fix and generate constructor ... just so that we can pass in parameters when we create a new instance of this class with these details. And the details will give it a default value of null, so that we don't have to supply the details. Because the idea of what we're going to do, if we're running in production, then we're going to return the status code. We'll have a standard message, server error, for example, and we won't return any details. But if we're running in development mode, then we'll have the status code, we'll have the actual message of the error, and the details will be the stack trace that we return. So now we're going to create some middleware, and if we go and take a look at the documentation for ASP.NET Core middleware, we have the ability to create our own middleware inside the pipeline. And this diagram here represents the request pipeline that consists of a sequence of request delegates called one after the other. And the following diagram demonstrates the concept. So inside our HTTP request pipeline, we can add middleware. So our request comes in, it hits some middleware, we process some logic, and then it calls next. And it goes to the next request delegate. Again, apply some logic if we have any, calls next, and so on and so forth. And we can also add logic on the way back out into the response as well. What we also see inside here is that exception handling delegates should be called early in the pipeline, so they catch exceptions that occur later in the pipeline. And if we go back to VS Code, then inside our startup class, this is where ordering is important. Our middleware takes place in order. And the developer exception page is right at the top, so that if any problems occur later on in other middleware, then it gets thrown back up the chain until we get to our developer exception page. And it's this one that we're going to swap. So what we'll do is in our API project, we'll create a new folder and we'll call it middleware. And inside here, we'll create a new C# class and we'll call it exception middleware. And inside this class, we're going to need a constructor. So we'll create a constructor. And in the parameters here, what we're going to need to do is pass in the request delegates. And we're going to call this next. And we'll bring in Microsoft ASP.NET Core HTTP. Remember, each piece of middleware is effectively a request delegate, and each one has a next method. And we'll also bring in the logger. So we'll bring in iLogger, and we'll add the type as exception middleware, and call this logger. And we'll also need to bring in Microsoft extensions logging. And what we'll also bring in is the iHost environment and call it env. And this is going to give us access to whether or not we're in development mode or production mode. And what we also need to do is initialize these fields from parameter. So let's just do this as well. And for the logger. And we'll also do this for the env as well. And let's bring this down. Okay, so what we need to do inside our middleware is we need to create a method, a public method, and say public async task, and we need to use the invoke async method. And let's bring in system threading tasks. And we'll pass in the HTTP context and call it context. So what we're going to do in here is we're going to add a try catch block. So we'll say try catch, and the catch is going to catch any exceptions. And we'll bring in using system for that. And we'll say EX and open up the block. Now in the try, what we're going to do is we're simply going to say await next. And we're going to pass through the HTTP context. So when a request comes in, it's simply going to pass straight through our exception handling middleware and continue on to the other middleware. But if we get an exception anywhere in our application, or our API request, I should say, then it's going to be caught by this piece of middleware. And we're going to get access to our exception inside there. And what we want to do, if we get an exception, we're going to log the error first of all. So we'll say logger.log error, and we're going to pass in the exception and the ex.message, and that's going to go into our normal logging inside our terminal window where we're running our application. So we're going to get access to what's happened inside there for sure. Then what we'll do is we'll say context and response and set the content type for what we're going to be returning, and it's going to be application/JSON, and then we're going to set the context response.status code, and we're going to set this equal to an int, so we're going to cast it to an int, and then we're going to say HTTP status code, which we get from system.net, and we're going to specify internal server error. And effectively this is going to set the status code to 500. Then we're going to create a response, and our response we're going to check to see if we're using the development mode. So we're going to say env and is development, and then we'll use a ternary to do one of two different things. If we are in development mode, then we want to send back the full exception with the stack trace. So what we'll do is we'll say new app exception and make use of the class we created before, and we'll need to bring this in from application core, and we'll pass in the context.response.status code. We'll pass in the exception message, and we'll pass in the exception.stacktrace or ex.stacktrace, which we'll need to use the optional chaining here. So we'll add a question mark, and then we're going to specify toString, because exceptions come with additional formatting options with the toString. It'll just put things down onto new lines, etc. And then for the alternate case where we're not in development mode, then we're going to say new app exception, and we're going to use the context response.status code again, and this time we're just going to specify server error, a very generic response if we're in production. And we're going to return this as JSON. And by default, typically JSON is returned in camel case unless we're setting it directly here. So what we need to do is create some JSON serializer options, and we'll say var options equals new JSON serializer options, and we need to get this from system.text.json, and then curly brackets, and then we could specify a property naming policy, and we'll say JSON naming policy.camelcase. And we can use these options to ensure that our response is in camel case rather than title case. So then we'll say var JSON equals JSON serializer dot serialize, and then we'll pass our response in as well as the options. And then we can say await context.response.write async, and we can pass in the JSON. And then we can head back over to our startup class and actually make use of this middleware. So in our startup class, we're going to remove the developer exception page. We're not going to use that anymore. And above the check to see if we're in development, we want our exception handling middleware to be right at the top of this. And we're going to say app.use middleware. And we're going to pass in our exception middleware. And we'll need to use the quick fix to bring in API middleware and just add parentheses. And now we've got our own custom exception handling middleware. And if we go back and repeat the request that we made to try and delete this non-existent activity, then we'll see a different kind of response here. And this time it comes back as JSON. Still the same information, of course. It's still an exception and we're still passing out similar details, but this is going to be easier for us to work with in our application. So we've got our status code 500, we've got our message, and then we've got the details which contains our stack trace. And notice it's not very clear in Postman, but these new lines will be displayed in our browser as actual new lines rather than the / or \n. So we're getting there. We've now got our HTTP responses taken care of, and we've got our exception handling taken care of centrally as well. What we'll take a look at next is we're going to do a small bit of preparation to make it easy to test our error responses on the client.